So today I would like to address an eminently historiographical topic that, as you read from the title, deals with the concept of the end of the Middle Ages. Substantially, you can see quite banally from certain history books, and especially the ones that are still used in school, tend to have a schematic um, and concise, narrative regarding to history in general, not just the Middle Ages, that between the 14th and the 15th century there is traditionally the idea of that the Middle Ages were ending, and they ended um, according to this view. As this is I give you immediately my idea. This is completely arbitrary to me. I mean, there is not really the end of the Middle Ages simply because there were no Middle Ages at all. We're talking about societies that had evolved sometimes from common paths, from a trend that you can argue to have been substantially a growth up to a certain point, and that and all the way more detailed data that can lead you to believe that there was the end of an epoch, or that there was something in common to this epoch in general. To me, the Middle Ages, however, do not exist, and we should look at the world perspective in different matters. However, refusing skeptically historiography and historiographical theories that have been used and are still obviously very important for our understanding of history cannot be done. In fact, and we should look at how, because this is also making history, looking at why and how historiography decided to put these these stakes, these limits, if anything else, for from a temporal point of view. It is indeed true that at a certain point, and specifically in the mid of the 14th century, the Western Middle Ages, and not just Western, telling the truth, but it was something that affected broadly Eurasia and even parts of Africa, were hit by this major plague, this pandemic plague that brought to an incredible, a really massive, structurally speaking, drop in demographics. This had a huge impact over Eurasian societies, and it tended to shape them in a certain fashion that is even comparable in all the various lands that were hit by this disaster. And one of the big questions at this point was, but first of all, was there before the plague something that really prepared it in a certain sense? Which seems an odd question, and I'll try to explain it better. Basically, it's been said that even before the plague, medieval society had gone towards a phase of, if not a recession, which definitely happened in some areas, at least of stall. The idea that the plague hit, independently from whether it was connected to these things or not. While European society and other medieval societies were already declining in a certain way, or at least they were stagnating in some measure. And I will explain it better because it sounds weird, especially if you pose this question by wondering whether the plague actually wasn't caused by a demographic crisis itself, or other crises of, economical or nature or other natural catastrophes. Because it's actually been argued also that great pandemics that hit the world in the past, in the Middle Ages, we have these two major things: the Justinian plague, that was the plague that hit in the mid-6th century the whole Eurasia, and that is normally conceived to have accelerated at that time the process of transformation from the late antique world to the early medieval one, which are obviously also in here historiographical conventions, but they can be supported theoretically, at least in generic terms. And then obviously this plague of the 14th century, and the Justinian plague kept hitting the European continent for other 2 centuries. I say the European continent, but at this time, especially through the contact of the Byzantine Empire, was a close contact with Near East, at least. So sometimes even these 2 areas are tied by a common fate. But it died out at a certain point after two centuries. These plague would hit cyclically speaking, and also here we don't really know how and why it happened, because just connecting that to famine and other predisposing factors is debatable. But probably it was the same scarce European demographic density that brought this plague not to expand so much, and especially the fact that Europeans at that time didn't travel so much. At least they didn't travel as much as they had been doing in the late antique world, or as they would have been doing from the low medieval times onwards. And the other major plague was in fact one of the 14th century that instead lasted cyclically until basically excuse me, I should drink a little while. So I feel better now. That hit essentially until the beginning of the 18th century. I think in Marseille, in southern France, in the 30s of the 18th century, in the 20s, I don't remember. Probably a witness to the fact that the European society from that time onwards, in spite of this major demographical collapse, still had a lot of people who traveled, and therefore this plague remained around, and cyclically it came to be. And yet we have already hinted to the possible connections to these plagues causes, because you might think that the plague arrived for fortuitous reasons, like, as it's normally said, the plague was carried on Genoese ships from the siege of Kaffa in Crimea against the Tartars. The Genoese were fighting against the successors of the Mongols in that area. And from these, or broadly speaking, from these southern European ports that were quite active at the time and in strong contact with the East, this plague, arrived into Europe. And in fact, southern Europe was the first to be hit in 1348. And then we have at every winter, when or at every year, that there is this jump that it did, going with the cycle of season. It arrived in Sweden, in Scandinavia, in at the beginning of the 50s. Even I don't remember whether in the 1353-54. There were areas of Europe that weren't hit. Seemingly Poland didn't suffer much of that, at least in the inner center. Even a very well-connected city like Milan in northern Italy, surprisingly, at least from what we know, wasn't hit by the plague. There were other areas, especially isolated areas, that weren't hit, but it was a black death that wiped out millions during its passage, and therefore, if we are told the story of the Genoese ships at the siege of Kaffa, where chemical warfare was used, and there were Mongols throwing rotten bodies died of plague from Asia, from the east at least, into the Genoese ranks, and that was carried to Europe. You might think then, yeah, it was because of that. It wasn't because it couldn't arrive in any other fashion. Today we tend to say, yeah, maybe that was a moment where this plague arrived, but considering all the contacts that there were between West and East, that was probably a modern, there was probably it had to arrive in any other way. It wasn't through the Genoese, it could have been through the Venetians, and indeed I'm sure that many ships actually carried isolated, ill people that got sick with the plague. So, however, there are people who say, but why did this plague actually spread so much? Can we really think that this illness was actually born somewhere into, it seems, in Mongolia, in Central Asia, and then it arrived all of a sudden for no reason, through the Silk route, in all over the Mongol dominions, into the whole Eurasia, and there weren't other things like that seemingly, or at least they were part of the same stock. I don't know how to say that relatively to pandemics. And other people said, well, yeah, it's possible, and that's probably how it really happened. But many people actually argue that there were other reasons of sorts, such as the fact of predisposing factors. If you read the chronicles of the 30s and the 40s of the 14th century, you read quite more often than it had happened in the past, that in those decades there had been a sort of generalized, I can't say climate change, but there was an increase of natural disasters, normally floods or winters that were too freezing, or summers that were too hot and or maybe too cold, and crazy weather, crazy environmental events that were unusual, and many people argued, well, look at how strange, in those 2 decades we have all these generalized disasters that are meant to have taken place all over the known world, or at least in Europe it was quite very well known. Chroniclers that time had a very far sighted range of understanding of, if, I don't know, an Italian merchant from Florence would know what was happening in England at that time, because he knew that. I mean, if there was a natural disaster into England, he would know first, because then maybe a guy living in Transylvania, but let's say that in the chronicles that were written, there was a pretty good understanding of what was happening, especially among Western Europeans. And it seems that these disasters were scattered all over Europe, and probably it had nothing to do with Europe itself, but it was rather something happening all over the world. Probably climate change due to, we don't know what exactly, because our sources are pretty scanty, but it's still very solid to see how these disasters were recorded and how they can be used as a solid historical datum in here. So people said that at a certain point the plague from Central Asia actually came all over the world because this world had had already fallen in some way. There were predisposing factors, cold, poverty, famine, and therefore the spread of the infection, of the contagion, was accelerated, at least in its speed. I'm talking from a strictly geographical, spatial point of view. You know that the societies were at that time weaker, even for from an immunological point of view. The populations were poorer, worse fed, and therefore this plague exploded at that time. As always, and this is something I rather do often in my videos, I like to present with different historiographical perspectives to actually conclude that probably the major ones are not really excluding one the other. There is a great debate of how the plague occurred and why and what it caused in the 14th century, and there are debates in this sense also from other point of view, because the plague was a major event that obviously had a great impact over economy, demographics, and consequentially politics and other social matters. But there are debates, even when thinking about the end of the Middle Ages, that are pointing at another direction, or at least focusing on certain other aspects of European civilization. And for instance, the problem of when the Renaissance actually started. Normally, I come from a country in which we give a lot of importance about the Renaissance, but we don't give to it a periodizing importance. I know that in Anglo-Saxon countries it's very common to address the Renaissance, or the Renaissance in French, from which the word derives, as a sort of a periodizing moment. Also and especially because Tudor England had a certain role in that sense, and British history is very peculiar from that point of view, because actually the Renaissance arrives in there much later than in other countries in Europe in many ways, and for certain historical reasons maybe we'll be talking about one day. So it's easier to make the early modern age looking at the Renaissance and so on. In other countries we don't really believe that the Renaissance has that periodizing importance, but we tend really to confine that to the cultural world of those times. Because the Renaissance, in a broadly periodizing way, it seems like a rebirth that happened, in all fields of society. So it's not surprising that the Anglo-Saxon world chose this role of the Renaissance, this meaning of the Renaissance. But in other countries it's a bit different. And there are obviously also there is also a lot of debate, not much about what is the Renaissance, so whether it's a broadly social phenomenon or an elitist movement among these scholars and other people, of cultured people that created it. But they probably didn't even create it, because you can't find pre-humanism basically even in the darkest medieval centuries, in my opinion, but this is just my opinion. But what I think is that there is also a lot of debate, which is very interesting in my opinion, on when the Renaissance actually was born. And people who look at the Renaissance usually think either at Italy and certain figures. Normally it's with Petrarch, Francis Petrarch, that commonly humanism is thought to have been born. And Petrarch, or Petrarca in Italian, was definitely a man who pushed very much in that direction, and he definitely embodies the characters of humanism of his times. But you can argue that compared to the Neoplatonistic court of the Medici in the 15th century, those were much more humanists than Petrarca, and you might want to find in same Petrarca a lot of what are meant to be typically medieval thoughts or ideas, even relatively to culture, that make him look maybe backwards compared to to what happened later in the full humanistic age. I believe that that actually before Petrarca himself, a sort of humanism was inherent in the same fact that Western Europeans believed that the classical world had been a great thing anyway. I mean, you don't find a moment in the Middle Ages, maybe just during the Romano-Germanic period, in which it was a culture that didn't recognize the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans as a model, as a cultural model. Probably, in fact, during the moment of and in those societies that were mostly Germanic, for instance, you find this Germanic pride that instead was fueled by the idea of the Germanic epics and these heroes of the sagas. But let's say that indeed by the 14th century world Europe was looking at the classical world as the model from which by which being inspired in order to build up something functional that was perceived to have been in the past. And this tells you, however, how probably more aware of the ancient world the medievals actually were than we expect. And there is always a recurrent idea that was a bright past, whether it was from a civic point of view or more broadly from a religious point of view. Many Christ was born in the Roman Empire, and that's where from when the Christians began to think about that. That period in history and the Roman Empire as the cradle that had been chosen by God for Jesus to be born. And if you look at Christian art during the Middle Ages, it's all about many happenings that happened in the Gospels that were set in the Roman Empire. So it was pretty much obvious that the Europeans always had in mind that model, even before the humanists actually canonized that in certain other things. And humanism was this idea of collecting as many books as possible and studying them, trying to reconstruct the past, to have a philological skill, and to look at the world as something so interesting to be studied in perspective, and where it was began to be felt that the medieval age was something so dark and gloomy of ignorant people. But if you really go look in all the intellectuals of the medieval age, even in the early Middle Ages, badly called dark ages, you find that those thinkers were really pretty much on the same line of those guys. They were probably more ignorant than the humanists, but essentially that love for the past and the ancient knowledge was already there, and you can argue that it was a seed that flourished in the humanist that blossomed in the humanistic entourage, but it essentially was probably culturally a very intimate and very old part and constitutive part of European culture since a very early age. And when you discuss historiographically speaking about these topics, what you notice is that historiographical currents tend to be such for an ideological reason. You know, there is the point that people, and this is something that you find constantly even when you spread videos like this on the internet, etc., that and from the comments of the average person, you understand that most people and definitely the vast majority of people reason not because they have a legitimate curiosity and they know how to find an answer, but they substantially give judgment and build up theories that they end up to sclerotize and to be idealized and absolutized. I don't know how to say that in English, and that are very difficult to be I can't it's easy to disprove them, especially when they're quite naive, but you understand that people will keep believing them if they don't have an additional knowledge to them. So when you look at historiography, you have to think that there were people back then that probably knew much more than the average scholar today, in quantitative terms, but the average scholar today knows the perfection work that was done on the shoulder of many scholars coming before him, and obviously today we have a better view of the world. But back in the day, formulating those theories, those historiographical theories, really meant a lot. And if you don't understand that, if you don't understand historiography, you also don't understand how the same knowledge that you have, because 70% of that historiographical theory is right. It's the other 30% that is wrong because the historian came to a wrong conclusion. But behind that, there is still a huge world of thousands and thousands of scholars who had worked much more than you, and that you have to understand, and you have to contextualize in their own your own historical period, in their beliefs, etc. And it's fascinating because in the process you learn history too, by learning history of historiography. And therefore, coming back to the major topic here, how is really the end of the Middle Ages interpretable? Whether it's a matter of economical reasons, political reasons, social reasons, religious, cultural, broadly meant. The answer is it's the wall. It's the wall influencing one another factors, and if you want to privilege one factor over the other, you have at least to prove it historically speaking. I personally, for instance, not always, but most of the times, and especially in the Middle Ages, I get the impression that probably the political and social structures were more important. Probably even more than the economical ones, and yet you can find a specialist in his own field who will tell you that maybe, economical changes were more important, or maybe religious changes were more important, and there is a constant debate. But the problem probably is that everybody who owns these favoritisms, this kind of favoritism, is wrong if he or she doesn't look to other fields and doesn't enlarge his or her own knowledge regarding other disciplines. And this is valid also for the same idea of history. You know, if you want to study history, you can't just, you know, think of reading history books. You have to be versed in something else. You have to understand technology, you have to understand theology, you have to understand anthropology, you have to understand a lot of things, literature, philosophy, chemistry. Otherwise, you can't really understand how this world worked, and you understand how huge the historical work is, and how, you know, the perspective of a single man in comparisons are always very, very narrow, and very small is the knowledge of that single person in comparison, almost in influence. So can we say at least, you know, that among the 14th and 15th century there was the end of a civilization. I mean, a world that through these major epidemics in a certain way changed so much that it had to be open to something else. Because it's very important to say that. Well, first of all, I'm prone to say in part yes. In part yes, because you see, the Black Death struck in a moment in which European society was very, very enlarged. I mean, from a demographical and economical point of view, the Europe of the early 14th century was something that you don't find in many areas in quantitative terms in that way, not even into the modern age up to a certain point. And before the Black Death, by the way, and this is probably a coincidence, but probably up to a certain point, you understand that we don't really know that world that well. You know, yeah, we have major holes in our knowledge of certain societies of even of Western Europe from the 15th century, or certain ages of the modern age, certain parts of the modern age, let's say. But generally speaking, you know, that world before the Black Death, it seems to be much more obscure to us, and yet much more developed than we can figure out. I mean, after the Black Death, we can track pretty well the evolution of Western society up to our times. People began to write more. Society was transformed in a certain way. So we can argue that whether we're talking about a medieval age or not, what happened in the mid of the 14th century really changed that world from what it was into something very different. Can we talk about crisis? Yes, in a part. Can we talk about rebirth? Yes, in a part. But we shouldn't stress that too much, because when you go in detail to see sources from the period of the Black Death, you don't notice, you don't immediately notice that mess that had happened. I mean, it's not that the world stopped and then it restarted from new people. It was always the same people living through that period, and they saw the horrors of the Black Death. They saw the decline of the world that they had known. They even changed their views about the world, but essentially they were always the same people. So sometimes it's striking how in sources you find that, I don't know, the plague in those years, it's just like an event recorded like you know, others that had been there, probably of exceptional, you know, influence, of exceptional importance, but still something that in their minds was still possible. It wasn't seen like, you know, the universal flood. It was seen as probably a a, a punishment for the world's sins, conceived in a Christian perspective. It was seen as a great catastrophe, but hey, the world went on, and this is the beauty of humans, that it doesn't matter how dark their lives are, how miserably they live, how much they can hate, and how much they can be evil. Even there is still this spark of of hope, of something that goes ahead, and it's recorded as such, as something that there is a perspective for the future always. We can say that between this crisis and the rebirth, the European society in this sense lived through a process in which there were experiences that probably looked unpredictable, as many others in the past had been, because this is also a matter of perception. When we look at history, we're not given by sources scientific data for which we can understand, how massive a process, changed human minds. Just imagine when historians will study in the future how the social networks changed our world. If you really think about it, yeah, we all know how much the world has been changed by that, but it's not that we repeat it all the day long. We simply say, well, yeah, it was a major change, but it's not something that normally you would be talking about. Like, you would be much more focused on the social network proper and things you read and do there, rather than assessing the phenomenon as it is. And this for saying that all it matters from the sources is really their own perspectives, their own impressions, rather than trying to figure out through them what really happened, because you can be sure that through no source you can understand how history actually went in practice. And therefore the unpredictability and especially the instability of the world was something normal at that time. Today we in our world we try to keep everything balanced with economics or society and politics, even though major changes occur, as we were saying. But even 70 years ago, think of World War II, a world that was literally destroyed, and yet people lived through that. And think of how it could be in Middle Ages with continuous wars, with continuous political instability, with misery, uncertainty for the future. And the general idea that things had to pass, because in a Christian perspective, that world was so miserable because it was meant to be so. It was meant to be unjust. It was meant to be unfair. Justice does not belong to this world. This is the idea, and therefore probably from the medieval people who lived that through that moment, it wasn't something so enormously different from what they had experienced in different other ways in their past. And this probably tells us, telling the truth, how really those people did their best, because throughout all this mess, what you find is that the world didn't decline. After this major blow of the pandemics and all the people who died and all the economical contractions and all, the changing that had happened, substantially the political entities that were there remained there. Think about it. Were structures like city-states, princedoms, kingdoms, lordships that more or less survived the plague without any sensible, fracture overall. And telling the truth, one of the major historiographical themes regarding this is really asking how did the plague do well to, especially to people who were at the top. Not just because they probably were more healthy and less exposed to illness in some way, although it was pretty transversal in many ways. I mean, the way people died during the plague. But it seems that there was, through the plague, a sort of verticalization of society. The idea that there were less people with a little bit less of the previous material wealth that existed before, but that now got the one of all the others who had died during. And I think that in times of trouble, there is always a push towards a leader, towards a head, towards someone who can put things right, at least for some times, which is not necessarily a beautiful thing, because you see that from very devastating crises were born terrible regimes and hatred and a lot of stuff like that. But it seems that, at least in the specific context of 14th and 15th century Europe, the plague did well, in fact, to the stabilization of local politics. It's not that all of a sudden the political map of Europe became, stable and firm and steady, and idling. There were still lots of wars. There was still a lot of, of instability. But in a certain sense, there was an asset that was heading towards a major stabilization, and not just in terms of who was in charge, but also in the differentiation of social classes that is typical of the Ancien Regime. The modern European society was much more crystallized and idling within social classes than it was the one of the High Middle Ages. This is for sure, and even more probably the one of the Early Middle Ages, which means that in the late Middle Ages you see that those who were in that social position tried to remain. Not tried to remain in it because they were content of that, but they basically were stuck to that. Also in terms of actual possibilities, there was an elite that was always more elite. There was a middle class that was always more subservient to that and clientelally related to it, and a stratum of very really many and very poor peasants who worked for this system to be to hold, essentially, and to work. However, we shouldn't think of that also as if in the late Middle Ages there was no political dialectics. However, there is the general tendency to see this coexistence that of various social classes that is based on this equilibrium and of this social stratification. And obviously also certain sort of in this you can find both in society and between political entities both an antagonism within and between each other, and also certain bonds, certain links, so a certain way of, even a specular way in which to recognize each other. There were certain social classes that definitely built up an identity that went beyond even the geographical extraction. Think about merchants or judges or notaries or doctors or even the same nobles. European history at that time was pretty transversal at that point. It didn't really matter where you came from. It was more important to think what social status you were. This is something that ends only with the end of the Ancien Regime. It's just with 19th century nationalism that people began to reason more in terms of where are you from and which language you speak and what look you have. Late medieval, indeed the same medieval world as a whole, but even modern age were instead much more based on this idea that was, there was still a sort of universalism left in this conception, the idea that maybe religion was a more gluing factor in terms of identity and also in certain other aspects, or in fact their profession or what political side you chose rather than where you came from. And this is important because when you look at medieval civilization and the the autumn of the modern age, you find that Europeans were actually quite open-minded people in many ways compared to today. Sure, there were horrible people at large considering our moral standards. They had prejudices. They surely discriminated on the base of even of extraction. They had prejudices, and some of which were completely absurd. Like, I don't know, the Spanish believed in the 16th century that the English had a tail, for instance, and were sort of animals. You find this horrible stuff. But at the same time, you find that there was a lot of dialogue. There was a lot of understanding. There was a lot of understanding of the external world. And it was a great push, a great need of finding a common, a common scale of interpreting the world, which is a topic that very interesting and a concept that really was much more of a modern thought, especially in the 17th century. But it's something that, in some ways, was born also through the humanistic ideals, because it was believed at that point that there were certain canons for the world that were being fixed from ancient models, from people who had a higher knowledge of the world. And I think that I like the Middle Ages more and this pre-humanistic thinking, because the medievals in this sense instead were even more open-minded, because they believed that whatever happened was they were quite they obviously had a great care in understanding whether something was normal from a religious point of view. I mean, not the religious morals, but from what was written in the Holy Scriptures. I mean, if an animal hadn't been described by one of the fathers of the church, and they would see an animal coming from the far east of Asia and that in Europe they'd never seen, a medieval would start questioning, but where is this written in the Scriptures? But more generally speaking, and especially before the 13th century, what you have is that the world was conceived by medievals as a great symbol that had to be constantly investigated, because it was a symbol that had been created by God for men to be deciphered, at least in part. And therefore the whole world had a meaning that had to be understood, that had to be interpreted. And this is why the medievals were the most thirsty of knowledge of the people I can think of, historically speaking, because not even in the Enlightenment you find this curiosity and need of knowledge. In the Enlightenment you find more or less the idea that you need a criterion of classification, and then you can put all inside that and that container, essentially. The medievals didn't have these limits. They said, whatever I see, I have to understand it, because it's something unique in its kind, and it's done for me by God. And that's where I have a moral responsibility as a Christian to investigate it, which is very fascinating, but we're going a bit too far. The video is already quite long as it is. What can I say? I was very pleased to make this lesson. Today I wasn't very happy, but talking with you, I gained a bit of spirit. And I hope you found it interesting. Sometimes here I still don't have many viewers, but I don't know how how much you listen to me, but it's as if I was talking with someone and trying to make it understand what I have in mind. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if it's the case, please share it, which is very useful for me. Otherwise, just leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you want to know more. And if you have questions, or you would even like me to make a video about a certain topic, you can suggest me. Please write me in either in comments or in the email, and I'll be glad to take that into consideration. So I wish you a nice time wherever you are, and at next time. Bye.